in the heart of the forgotten lands where the wind refused to age. And the baobab trees stood like ancient sentinels cradling secrets in their gnarled arms. There lay a village swallowed by time, a place where no crow ever cawed, no clock ever ticked, and no child had been born for 2 generations. This was Oju Olokan, the village where time stopped. And beneath its cracked red soil slumbered a curse as old as the ancestors' first breath. And it began, as all tragedies do, with love turned to greed. For once upon a midnight so many seasons ago, an old woman named Mama Agba, revered for her beauty and youth and feared for her silence in age, sat before her cracked mirror with a wooden comb carved from the bones of her twin sister, muttering forgotten incantations to gods whose names no longer held meaning, drawing youth from the heads of her bloodline, combing away the years from her own wrinkled skin and transferring them into the strands of her grandchildren's hair, which blackened with age and crumbled to ash while hers gleamed with life. And no one knew the price until the land itself grew still. The animals stopped birthing, the rain forgot its song, and one by one, children began to vanish on their 7th birthday, leaving only the scent of smoke and the echo of their laughter caught between the trees. But none dared speak of Mama Agba, not even when she passed away at the stroke of her 117th year and was buried facing east, her cursed comb clasped in her skeletal hands, buried deep beneath the central baobab where her cottage once stood, now a gaping hole in the village's memory. Yet when the moon turned red 3 nights in a row and a cold wind began to whisper the names of the long dead, the villagers gathered in dread and summoned the old griot, Babansia, who hobbled into the village square with his hollow drum and sand-colored robes, blind in one eye and knowing too much with the other. And as he placed his hand upon the soil and listened to the ground breathe, he whispered only one word, awakened. Before the earth groaned, the sky blinked, and the baobab bled sap like tears. And from the east came a humming, soft and hollow like a woman singing underwater. And the villagers knew then that time had not only stopped, but something that once slept was now stirring. And when little Areti, the only child left in Oju Olokan, disappeared that night, leaving behind only a circle of unburnt candles and a trail of combed-out hair arranged like a path leading to the cursed tree, the silence that followed was not merely of grief but of recognition, for the dead had begun to speak, and their voices came not from the ground, but from the braids of the living, unrefused to rise over Oju Olokan, and the rooster's crow died in its throat. Like a secret left unspoken, the villagers gathered in tense silence beneath the bleeding baobab, their faces lined with fear and the faint glimmer of memories too ancient to be theirs. For Babansia had commanded them not to touch the trail of hair left behind by Areti, warning that it was not merely hair but a voice woven in strands. And as the wind picked up and rustled through the braids like fingers flipping through pages of an unread story, the sound it made resembled weeping, soft, layered with echoes. And deep within the center of that sorrow rose the whisper of a girl's laughter, warped by time, calling from beneath the tree's roots. Yet no one dared move closer except for Asha, Areti's elder cousin, and the last living girl born before the drought of Wams began, her body 17, but her eyes carrying centuries, who stepped barefoot onto the path of hair as though summoned by blood itself, her skin prickling with the memory of every ancestor that had once sung her to sleep in dreams. She no longer remembered, and with each step, the air thickened, the sky dimmed, and the baobab creaked louder, splitting slightly at its base to reveal a narrow slit of shadow, from which poured the smell of burnt incense and old oil. And Asha, who had always felt the tug of voices in mirrors and the itch of unseen hands while she slept, knew without being told that she was chosen not to find Areti, but to finish the curse their grandmother had buried alive. So she pressed her palm against the tree and was instantly pulled inward, not physically, but in spirit, falling into a space between spaces where time swirled in smoky rings. And the dead spoke not in words but in images. Visions of Mama Agba combing her hair before a glowing bowl filled with tears. Faces of children fading like mist, and a giant serpent made of braided hair circling a well whose water rippled with screams. And as Asha fell deeper into the vision, she saw her own face reflected in the comb held by a hand made of bone. And just before she could scream, Baban Sia's voice echoed in her ears, saying, "To break what was twisted, you must bleed willingly." And she woke gasping in the arms of the elders, who claimed she'd only been gone a heartbeat, yet her hair had grown 3 inches and turned completely silver. And her voice when she spoke was not her own but layered with the cadence of the ancestors, who warned that Ireti was not lost but bound, not in death, but in waiting. And to free her would require unburying what had been hidden for too long, starting with the cursed comb sealed beneath the tree, a relic no hand dared touch, but which now pulsed with hunger in the soil, craving the skin of bloodkin. That night, as the villagers of Oju Olokan locked their doors with salt and charcoal inscriptions traced over their thresholds, Asha sat alone beneath the bleeding baobab, her silver hair catching the dying moonlight like threads of ancestral fire, the voices in her head murmuring in tongues that bled into her thoughts like smoke through cloth. And though her body trembled from what she had seen within the tree's spirit, her fingers dug into the earth where the comb had been buried. With Mama Agba, the soil strangely warm and pulsing like flesh. And as she whispered the old chant she had not known, she remembered, "Oba Ori, Sanmi, Seilf, Ki Mo Ba Dimi Mi Paid." The earth cracked open with a low groan, splitting like a wound, revealing a hollow chamber lined with ancient bones braided together into a lattice of sorrow. And there, nestled in a nest of gray hair and ash, lay the cursed comb, blackened with age and glistening with a strange liquid that shimmered like blood and oil under moonlight. And the moment Ash's trembling hand reached forward, something cold wrapped around her wrist, a bony hand, no longer attached to a body, clutching her with the grip of the grave. And Mama Agba's voice slithered out of the soil, not screaming, not begging, but humming the lullaby she used to sing before she stole the youth from her daughters and granddaughters, a lullaby that made the trees lean closer and the air stiffen. And when Asha, shaking, pulled the comb free from the soil, the entire village shuddered as if slapped awake from centuries of silence. Every hut's door bursting open at once, revealing the villagers trapped in a trance, their eyes rolled back and mouths moving in unison, speaking the same phrase over and over. The braid must be undone before the well boils over. And just as the wind roared and lifted Asha into the air with invisible hands, the comb in her grip began to hum, not with song but with memory. And she was flung backward into the earth, landing in a pool of ancestral tears as visions surged into her of Mama Agba, kneeling before a mirror made of bone, offering her soul to an ancient river spirit named as Nwanyi in exchange for eternal youth, of the comb being forged not of wood but of cursed bone from her twin sister, who died birthing her first child, and of the binding spell that required a descendant's blood every 7 years to keep the curse fed. And Asha, now soaked in tears and mud, rose with fire in her eyes and a scream trapped in her throat, for she realized Ireti had been chosen as the next offering, and that the comb was not merely cursed, it was alive, and it now knew Ash's name. The comb whispered in Ash's hand as though it had lungs hidden deep within its cursed grooves, speaking not in language but in pulses of grief, betrayal, and ancient hunger. And as she stumbled back into the village square, her footsteps leaving blackened prints in the soil. She found every villager kneeling in the dust, their eyes wide open and pupils swirling like whirlpools, chanting in harmony with the hum of the comb. And above them all, Baban Sia stood atop a termite mound with his blind eye bleeding and his good eye glowing gold, his hollow drum pulsing in rhythm with Ash's heartbeat, as he declared in a voice layered with both man and spirit. The braid has been pulled, the curse remembers, and the mirror is cracked, before collapsing into the dust and dissolving into ash, leaving behind only his drum, which now beat itself as though struck by unseen hands, and Asha, shaking from the vision still clawing her mind, screamed into the night, but no one heard her, for the air had become too thick with memory and sorrow to carry sound. And then the sky above Oju Olokin tore open like old cloth, revealing not stars but a vast watching eye made of mist and shadow, blinking once before unleashing a silent scream that turned the baobab sap into black blood and sent rivers of it spilling into the village pots, where it carved symbols into the earth, symbols only Asha could understand, for they were the same ones that had been carved into her skin in dreams since childhood, always burning, always hidden beneath her hairline. And as she collapsed beside Baban Sia's smoking drum, the comb in her hands surged with light, lifting her into the air where her shadow lengthened and split into three, each shadow moving independently as echoes of her voice spilled from their mouths, each one telling a different story, one of a girl who defied fate, one of a child swallowed by love, and one of a curse disguised as a gift. And Asha realized she was now more than herself. She had become a vessel for those who had been lost, including Mama Agba's twin, whose screams she now heard beneath the hum of the comb, and Ayaretti's laughter, distant but growing clearer, guiding her toward the forbidden well at the edge of the village that no one had spoken of for 50 years, the same well where Mama Agba's twin was buried alive in silence and shadow. And as Ash's feet moved without command toward the ancient stones choked with vines and silence, the dead began to rise, not with flesh, but with memory, filling the village paths with the shapes of children who once were, eyes glowing like fireflies in fog, their mouths sewn shut with strands of hair, begging her to end what had begun, before the river goddess Ezenwanyu woke fully and dragged the whole village into the well of forgetting. Asha stood before the forbidden well, its ancient stones wrapped in crawling vines that hissed like serpents and pulsed faintly with breath as though the well itself was alive and dreaming, its mouth wide and black like the throat of a god that had forgotten mercy. And as she approached with the cursed comb glowing dimly in her hand, the whispers of the dead thickened around her like fog, curling into her ears and seeping through her skin, carrying fragments of the truth of how Mama Agba, once beautiful and beloved, had dragged her dying twin sister, Adaubi, to this very well on a blood moon night, whispering promises of peace, before casting her inside with a final stroke of the comb that split her soul in two, one half devoured by the river spirit Ezenwanyi, and the other trapped beneath the village, to fuel the curse with a child's youth every 7 years. And now that the curse had been disturbed, the well throbbed with hunger, eager for another sacrifice. But Asha, whose skin now bore the moving sigils of the ancestors and whose eyes glowed faintly with the memory of those before her, did not step back as the ground cracked open beneath her feet and the stone mouth of the well exhaled a cold wind that carried the scent of burnt hair and salt. And from its depths rose a figure, translucent and twisted, a shadow of Adaubi bound in braids of spectral hair, her mouth sewn with the same cursed threads, reaching upward with hands made of sorrow, but unable to speak. And as Asha raised the comb, the spectral Adaubi recoiled, not from fear, but from pain, her eyes pleading, And suddenly the comb vibrated violently and Asha screamed as her hand burned with ancestral fire. The comb branding her palm with the sigil of the firstborn, marking her as the final blood thread capable of ending the curse. And then the water in the well turned to mirrors, each one showing a different path, one where Asha gave in and became the next keeper of the curse, young forever but hollow, and one where she shattered the comb and broke the lineage's last tie to Ezenwani, releasing the dead and ending the cycle, though it would cost her her life. And before she could choose, the ground trembled as a new figure emerged from the mist, a tall, regal woman cloaked in river water and crowned in shells and sorrow. Her eyes vast and endless, her presence too ancient to bear it, was Ezenwani herself, awakened now by Asha's defiance. And she spoke not with words but with silence so thick it made the trees bend and the sky flicker. And in that silence, Asha saw her fate unfold, saw Ireti trapped beneath layers of hair in a place between spirit and memory. And she knew then that the comb was not the end, only the key. And the true prison was still ahead, buried not in the earth, but in the heart of the curse's first lie. The sky above Oju Olo condemned to a bruised violet as Ezenwani rose fully from the mist, her form rippling like a reflection on water disturbed by thunder, her eyes twin whirlpools of forgotten time, and her voice a vibration that bypassed the ears and struck straight into the chest. And Asha, though trembling beneath the weight of the river goddess's presence, stood firm at the edge of the cursed well, the comb still glowing in her branded hand, the sigil on her palm now bleeding slowly, not with blood but with a glowing silver essence that dripped into the soil and made it whisper. And the goddess circled her slowly, hair flowing like rivers across the ground, leaving puddles that shimmered with faces, children, women, unborn daughters, all bearing Asha's eyes, all silent until Ezenwani finally spoke through the stillness, not in threat, but in ancient sadness, revealing that the curse was never truly Mama Agba's alone, but a consequence of a broken pact made generations ago, when the women of Oju Olokan pleaded for beauty and endurance during famine, and offered their firstborn daughters in return. And Mama Agba, desperate to escape the decay of time, became the vessel through which that pact was fed, using the comb to pass the hunger-down bloodlines disguised as power. And now that Asha had stirred the comb and faced the well, the pact hung by a single breath, and Ezenwani offered her a cruel choice: to return the comb to the water and bind herself as the new vessel, becoming both guardian and prisoner, or to plunge the comb into the mirror water and shatter it forever, breaking the curse but also severing her from every soul bound by it, including Ireti, whose spirit was still tangled within the net of ancestral sacrifice. And Asha, heart thudding like a funeral drum, fell to her knees and wept, her tears hissing against the ground as the voices of the dead pressed closer, louder, pleading for freedom, for peace, for rest. And it was in that moment, with the wind screaming through the village and the baobab trees shaking like dancers in grief, that Ireti's voice pierced through all others, clear, bright, frightened, calling her name over and over. And Asha, eyes wide with resolve, rose with a roar, lifted the comb above her head, and plunged it not into the water but into her own chest, letting it pierce flesh and spirit alike. And at once the earth split, the well cracked, and the spectral braids screamed as the comb drank Asha's life force, binding her essence into itself, but not in surrender and rebellion, rewriting the curse with her blood. And as her body crumpled to the ground and the comb clattered beside her, glowing now with a soft, mournful blue, the children's spirits began to rise skyward, their mouths unstitched, their eyes closing one by one as they ascended, free at last, while Ezenwani faded with a sigh into the mist, her crown dissolving into scattered shells. And though Ash's body no longer moved, her voice whispered on the wind, promising that this was not the end but the unraveling of the lie. And far across the village, in the hollow of the baobab, Ayurvedi's small hand burst through the bark, reaching once more for the world. As the first rays of dawn clawed their way over the horizon, like reluctant memories returning to a grieving land, Oju Olokan held its breath in a silence deeper than any it had known in generations. A silence not of fear but of awe, for in the heart of the village where the baobab once stood unyielding, its bark now lay split open like a wound, and from within emerged a ruddy, barefoot and blinking, wrapped in a faint mist that shimmered with ancestral light, her hair woven with silver strands that pulsed faintly with Ash's essence. And the moment her foot touched the earth, the ground sighed, the trees straightened, and the air shifted as if a great pressure had lifted. Yet with her return came no celebration, for Ash's body still lay curled at the base of the cursed well, pale and still, the comb beside her now dull and cracked, no longer humming, no longer hungry. And the villagers, slowly waking from their trances, gathered with wide eyes and trembling hands, unsure whether to mourn or to bow, for they recognized Ayurvedi's face not only as a child saved but as a vessel of something older, something sacred. And Babansia's drum, though ownerless, began to beat once more with a slow, deliberate rhythm like the heartbeat of the earth. And Ayurvedi, now speaking with a voice far older than her years, told them that Asha had not died but had crossed into the in-between, the realm of threads, where the souls of ancestors weave and unweave destinies. And from there she now watched them all, no longer bound to flesh, but stitched into every shadow, every whisper of wind, every child's first cry. And the comb, broken but not dead, was to be buried not in soil but in story, passed down not to be used, but to be warned against. And so the elders, with tears and trembling prayers, built a shrine beneath the baobab's shattered roots, placing the broken comb atop a mound of salt and braided hair. And above it they carved a single word in the old tongue, Iwa, which meant truth. For it was not the curse that had nearly doomed them, but the denial of it. And as Ayurvedi placed her small palm over Ash's branded hand, a pulse of warmth spread through the soil, and the crops, long dead, began to sprout again. The birds returned, and the time that had once stopped began to move forward, not in haste but in harmony. And that night, as the moon rose full and soft like an ancestor's eye, the villagers lit 1,000 small fires and sang a song they did not know they remembered. A song for Asha, the girl who bled truth into the lie, the girl who turned a comb of death into a key of rebirth. As the days returned to Oju Olokan like hesitant birds rediscovering their sky, and time flowed once more through the cracked veins of the land, the villagers began to live again. Children were born with cries like songs, women dreamed without waking in sweat, and the wells ran clear and sweet. But deep beneath this fragile peace, a subtle unease still stirred. For though the curse had been broken, and Ash's sacrifice had sealed the comb's hunger, the soil still remembered, and in the wind there lingered whispers not of warning, but of watching. And Ayurvedi, though smiling and alive, often stood still, for hours beneath the baobab's remains, her silver-threaded hair shifting even when the air was still, her eyes distant as though she saw a place beyond the veil of sky and shadow. For within her echoed fragments of Ash's spirit, memories stitched into her bones, stories she hadn't lived but now carried. And on the 8th night after the curse's breaking, when the moon sat low and crimson on the horizon, a child named Lami wandered to the edge of the old forbidden well, drawn by a sound only he could hear, a soft tapping, rhythmic and slow, like a comb against wood. And though the well had been sealed with sacred ash and braided iron, the moment his foot touched the boundary, the tapping stopped and a single strand of glowing white hair slithered out from a crack, coiling around his ankle before fading into dust. And Lami screamed not from fear, but from the sudden flood of visions that poured into him. Memories of Ash's pain, Mama Agba's betrayal, and the river goddess's endless gaze. And when the villagers found him, eyes wide and unblinking, they brought him to Ireti, who placed her hand gently upon his brow. And the moment she did, the vision ceased, but her own body trembled as if struck, and she whispered only one thing before fainting: "The braid is regrowing." And panic rippled through the elders like fire on dry leaves, for they realized that the comb, though shattered, had not died but had merely been lulled to sleep. And somewhere deep within the weave of ancestral time, the threads of the curse had begun to stitch themselves anew, drawn by memory, pain, and blood. And that perhaps it was not the comb that had been cursed, but the bloodline itself, marked forever by the choices of their foremothers. And as the wind howled through the trees and the baobab's roots trembled faintly beneath the earth, the villagers knew that the story was not over, only waiting to be remembered again. On the 9th night, when the wind no longer followed the rules of the earth and even the birds dared not sing, a heavy stillness settled over Oju Olokan, as if the village were a drum skin, stretched too tight before the strike. And beneath this silence, Ireti awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and light, her body glowing faintly with silver runes that pulsed like slow thunder beneath her skin. And as she rose from her sleeping mat with eyes wide and ancient, she spoke in 3 voices at once, her own, Ash's, and one deeper, older, belonging to no one the villagers could name, and declared that the comb's shattered pieces had begun to hum again beneath the roots of the baobab, calling not for blood this time, but for reunion. For the curse had not been bound to the comb alone, but to the spirit of betrayal that had seeded it. And betrayal, once tasted, could not be forgotten by the earth that drank it. So as thunder rolled in a sky that held no clouds, Ireti, flanked by the trembling elders and a line of children carrying calabashes filled with river water and ashes, walked barefoot toward the sacred mound where the broken comb had been buried. And the moment her feet touched the boundary, the earth opened again, not in violence, but in invitation, revealing a staircase of braided roots glowing with ancestral light leading deep beneath the village, into the hollow heart where the first lie had been told. And there, suspended in the center of a vast chamber lit only by pulsing hair strands, floated the comb hole once more, but surrounded by the shadows of those it had touched, including Mama Agba, her twin Adaubi, and a weeping vision of Asha, all repeating the same phrase: "It is not enough to break the comb. You must untangle the truth." And Ireti stepped forward, unafraid, her silver runes burning brighter with each step, until she stood before the floating relic, and with both hands she reached into the pulsing strands and began to comb them, not with a tool, but with her fingers, her memories, her pain unraveling each knot woven from shame, secrets, and silence. And with every thread untangled, a scream tore through the chamber, shaking the bones of the land itself, until at last the last strand loosened and the comb dissolved into a mist of light and ash, the chamber collapsing inward like a breath held too long, and Ireti fell with it, swallowed by the earth, her scream echoing like a song cut short. And on the surface, the baobab tree groaned and then bloomed for the first time in living memory, flowers the color of bone and moonlight bursting across its limbs. And the sky rained softly, not with water, but with strands of silver hair that turned to smoke as they touched the ground. And though the village mourned, they also understood, for Ireti had not vanished. She had become the thread that bound memory to truth, and her name would never be forgotten. For every time the wind passed through the leaves of the baobab, it whispered, "She untangled us all." Years passed like quiet footsteps across the healed soil of Oju Olokan, and though time once stopped, there had resumed its gentle dance. It never returned unchanged, for the village now lived with the quiet reverence of a people who had spoken to gods, bled for truth, and watched a child become legend. And beneath the great baobab tree that now bloomed year-round with pale blossoms, that glowed in moonlight and sang when the wind passed through them, a shrine had been carved not of stone or bone, but of memory, its walls woven from strands of silver hair that shimmered softly, and within it lay no comb, no relic, no idol, only silence, the sacred kind that held echoes of voices once trapped, now free. And though Ireti never returned in flesh, her presence was known in every dream, every ripple of the well's water, every cry of a newborn wrapped in white cloth and salt. For she had become the breath of the village, the truth within its soil, and the wisdom in its wind. And the children, now born freely and with names passed down from those who came before, grew up knowing that power does not lie in what we inherit, but in what we choose to untangle, in the courage to name what others buried. And so they told her story around fires, under stars, in dance, in rain, with no embellishment, no grandeur, just the weight of its truth. And the cursed comb, now dissolved into spirit, never returned, though sometimes, when the air grew still and the moon sat low and gold like a resting drum, the wind would carry a single strand of glowing hair across the village and lay it gently on a doorstep, a quiet reminder that what had been broken could still heal, and what had once devoured could one day protect, if held with reverence and never forgotten. And so Oju Olokan thrived, not because the curse had ended, but because the people had remembered. And with every birth, every braid, every story whispered beneath the baobab's bloom, they honored the girl who combed the past free and became the thread by which they held the future. But even as peace threaded itself through the daily rhythms of Oju Olokan, and laughter returned to the soil like long-lost rain, the balance that had been restored remained delicate. For far beyond the village passed the rivers that forgot their names, beyond the hills that whispered only in riddles, something old stirred beneath the bed of Lake Omi Air, a place once sealed by ancestral song, now cracking at its heart. And though the villagers did not yet know it, the unraveling of the curse had loosened more than just a single thread. It had weakened the knots of other pacts made in desperation, other relics buried in silence. And one night, as the moon rose pale and thin like a blade, a traveler arrived at the edge of Oju Olokan, limping, cloaked in tattered ochre robes, her face veiled, her hands scarred with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. And though she said no word, the moment her shadow touched the earth, the baobab's blossoms began to fall, each petal turning to ash before it hit the ground. And Ireti's shrine groaned softly, not in pain, but in warning, as if the village's memory had sensed a returning storm. And the elders, older now, but still bound to the sacred drum left by Babansia, gathered beneath the tree, their faces lined not just with age but with foreboding. For they had dreamed of a stranger who would arrive barefoot with eyes full of water, and a relic hidden in her breath. And when they stepped forward to meet her, the veiled woman lifted her hand and dropped something at their feet, a comb, not made of bone or wood, but of obsidian and fire, humming not with hunger, but with mourning. And though it looked nothing like the cursed one Asha had destroyed, the elders knew at once it was born from the same wound, a sibling relic awakened by the loosening of ancestral bindings. And as the stranger spoke her first words, her voice cracked the air like lightning on dry leaves, whispering, "The curse was only one thread. Now others unravel." And before they could question her, she vanished into mist, leaving only the comb behind, which vibrated softly, resonating with the earth like a distant drumbeat growing louder. And from the shadows beyond the baobab, the spirits of the old forest stirred, no longer silent, no longer content to sleep. And the children, who had never known fear, began to wake screaming with dreams of mirrors that bled and rivers that spoke in voices that didn't belong to them. And so once more the village stood at the edge of something unseen, its peace trembling, its past not finished, and the story, it seemed, had begun to braid itself again. By the 12th night, Oju Olokan had changed in ways the eyes could not see but the bones could feel. For though the comb of obsidian and fire had been locked away beneath 3 layers of salt, sacred cloth, and silence within the shrine of Ireti, its hum still threaded through the air like a memory trying to be born. And the village, once revived by truth, now trembled at the edge of forgetting again. For dreams had turned bitter, and mirrors grew restless, showing not reflections but echoes, children staring back with eyes to old, mouths moving in reversed speech, while water no longer reflected the sky but flickered with images of faces no longer alive. And though the elders burned herbs and beat the sacred drum left by Babansia, the drum's rhythm no longer matched the heart of the earth. It staggered, like a wounded bird trying to sing. And in this rising unease, the youngest daughter of the potter, Zulai, a child barely 7 and born beneath the night Asha died, began to speak in a language no one taught her, braiding strands of grass into intricate shapes she claimed were maps. And when pressed, she whispered that the woman made of shadow and flame was calling her, that the comb was not cursed but calling home its sisters, scattered across the old lands before time had names. And in her dreams, Zulai walked a path lined with mirrors that bled and trees that sang in sorrow. And each step she took brought her closer to a throne carved from broken combs and braided bones, where a faceless queen waited with arms wide and empty eyes. And though the village tried to keep her from wandering, one morning Zulai vanished, leaving behind only her last braid coiled beside the shrine and a trail of burnt footprints, leading into the forest. And the baobab groaned again, its blossoms falling like tears, and from its roots rose not blood this time, but smoke that formed into the shape of Ash's face, her eyes closed, her mouth barely moving, whispering a single word again and again, "Undo." And so the elders gathered once more, hearts heavy, realizing that the breaking of one curse had not ended the wound but exposed how deep it truly went. How many relics had been born of the same forgotten bargain, and that the story Asha died to finish had only been the prologue to something greater, something older. And as they looked to the horizon, a storm of ash and feathers rolled in from the direction of Lake Omier, and from its heart came a sound that was not thunder, not wind, but the low, guttural growl of something that had waited too long to be remembered, and had now returned not to curse, but to collect. As the storm of ash and feathers unfurled over Oju Olokan like the wings of a long-dead deity, shaking off the dust of eternity, the elders stood in silence, watching the black sky swallow the last of the stars, and beneath that ink-stained dome, the whispers began again, not from mouths, but from soil, from walls, from the very bones of the village itself. And they spoke in tongues lost before the first drumbeat, tongues that only the dead remembered and the cursed obeyed. And it was from this whispering earth that Zulai's older brother, Ifean, was summoned by a dream not his own, one in which he stood atop a mountain of severed braids, while the faceless queen placed a crown of teeth upon his head and told him he was now the bearer of undoing, that the braid his sister left was a key, not a farewell, and that only one who had shared her blood could find what she had been led to. For the comb was only one of 7, and the others had already begun to stir, unearthed by times, hunger and memory's ache, and Phaon, though just 15, knew then what the elders feared to say, that Zulai had not been taken, but chosen, and now he too was bound to the old path, the path carved before language by the hands of women, who whispered to storms and braided fate into hair. And so, in the hour when dogs refused to bark and birds flew backwards, Phaon followed the trail of burnt footprints into the forest, clutching his sister's last braid wrapped in a cloth made from their grandmother's burial shroud. And as he walked, the forest changed around him, the trees bending into arches, their bark peeling into faces that cried sap and sang riddles, the ground splitting open to reveal silver roots that pulse like veins, and above it all, the sound of combs clashing in the wind like swords of old queens. And deeper still he wandered, until the air grew thick with scent palm wine, blood, river mud, and burning hair, and then the throne appeared, not carved this time but grown, alive, breathing, made of hair and hope and horror, and beside it stood Zulai, her eyes glowing with firelight and her voice no longer that of a child but of many, speaking in chorus, telling Phaon that the faceless queen was not faceless after all, but mirrored the one who held her comb last. And thus Phaon saw in her face his grandmother, her eyes young again, and mouth cruel with longing. And then the truth struck him like a gourd shattering on stone. The comb had never been a curse by itself. It had been a vessel, and the true curse had always been the hunger it fed. The same hunger that now pulsed in the throne's heartbeat and in Zulai's voice. And as Phaon reached for her, the braid in his hand burst into flame, and from it rose not smoke, but a serpent made of ash and memory, winding around them both, whispering the name of every ancestor who had ever touched the cursed comb. And one by one, their spirits stepped from between the trees, weeping, howling, laughing, as they encircled the siblings, waiting not for vengeance, but for release. As the ancestors formed a spectral circle around Phaon and Zulai, their voices rising in a mournful harmony that made the leaves curl inward, and the ground tremble with sorrow, the serpent of ash slithered into the air, unwinding its coiled body into a spiral that stretched toward the sky like a staircase of smoke. And from its coils descended a figure draped in garments woven from dusk and silence, her eyes two wells of ancient grief, and her hair a river of combs tangled with bones. And all who saw her fell to their knees within their spirit, for she was a Lugbeya, the first braider, the one who had created the original combs not for youth but for remembrance, tools meant to braid stories into generations. But her gifts had been twisted by greed, and now she had returned not to punish, but to weigh, and her voice was not heard through ears but through marrow as she asked the circle, "Who among you will unbraid the hunger sown by your blood?" And Phaon stepped forward, his hands still smoldering with the fire from the braid, and said he would carry the burden of undoing. But Olugbeya's gaze fell heavy upon him, and she warned that undoing meant forgetting not just the curse, but the joys, the names, the songs, the very stories of the line that had been touched by the comb's teeth. And Zulai, still bound to the throne, wept not tears but strands of her own hair that fell like feathers, each one singing a lullaby of the old days, of moonlit dances, and whispering mothers. And the spirits began to waver, torn between release and vanishing. For if the comb's power was erased, so too would their memory fade from the living world. And in that moment, Ifayan saw the true price of restoration, not destruction, but sacrifice of remembrance. And yet he took the ash serpent in both hands, letting it bite into his palms and feed on his blood. And the forest howled as a great silence fell, deeper than death, older than origin, and one by one, the combs embedded in Ulugbeya's hair dissolved into ash and floated upward like fireflies, returning to the stars, and Zulai's glow dimmed, her voice returning to that of a child, as the throne cracked open, releasing a gust of wind that smelled of childhood and endings, and all around them, the spirits began to dissolve, not in agony but in peace, their faces softening into forgotten smiles, as they vanished into the roots, leaving behind only echoes that would never again speak unless summoned by truth. And Ulugbeya faded with them, her final whisper falling like rain upon the forest. What is not remembered must not be repeated. And so the forest grew still, the arching trees straightened, and the night slowly lifted, leaving Ifayan and Zulai standing barefoot beneath the new dawn, the braid now gone, and in its place, a comb of clear bone, blank and harmless, waiting to be buried, not wielded. In the days that followed the vanishing of Ulugbeya and the stilling of the ash serpent, Oju Olokan entered a silence so profound it felt like the entire village was holding its breath beneath the weight of an unseen gaze. For though the sky had cleared and the forest had softened its voice, the people moved as if walking on the edge of a blade, afraid that even their memories might betray them. And so the elders gathered once more beneath the baobab now bare of blossom and bleeding no more, and they asked the earth what must now be done with the comb of clear bone, the last relic of a legacy braided in sorrow. And the earth replied with silence, forcing the decision back into mortal hands. And so Ifayan and Zulai were brought before the shrine, their presence alone enough to stir the fireless torches into flame. And with a slow and solemn motion, the girl-child reached out and placed the comb upon the tongue of the shrine's mouth, carved from stone and soot. And as it touched the cold lips, the entire village saw a vision not with their eyes, but within the drumbeat of their chests of the first mother braiding the stars into the night, each strand a story, each knot a memory. And they understood then that the combs had never been the curse, only the hunger placed into them. And that hunger had been born of forgetting the sacred nature of legacy, of turning story into power rather than prayer. And so the elders declared that no comb made from bone, ash, or fire would ever again pass from hand to hand without a song, a story, and a sacrifice. And a new ritual was born that day, the rite of unbraiding, where each year the children would gather round the shrine and retell the story of the grandmother who stole youth, the girl who spoke to mirrors, the boy who burned for truth, and the queen who wept combs, not to keep the fear alive, but to ensure forgetting never came again. And from that day, Oju Olokan walked gently into the future, its people quieter, wiser, and tethered to one another through story as tightly as hair, woven in love. And though Zulai's dreams still wandered beyond the trees and Ifayan's hands never fully healed, they lived long enough to see a generation rise that no longer feared the forest. For they had learned that sometimes, to survive a curse, you must remember not just the pain but the path that led to it. Many seasons passed like whispered songs through the branches of the now silent baobab, and Oju Olokan thrived quietly, its people growing crops with laughter, birthing children with braided blessings, and honoring the old rites without dread. Yet beneath this gentle rhythm, the earth remembered, for memory is not only held by people, but by stone, by wind, by the bones of the land. And deep beneath the village where forgotten rivers ran like veins of time, something stirred a sliver, of obsidian buried long ago before even Olugbea's first braid. A shard not of the cursed comb, but of the mirror that once showed the faceless queen her hunger. And it pulsed faintly now, sensing a fracture in the silence. Drawn to a new voice not of grief or greed, but curiosity, for the world above had grown peaceful, and in peace, vigilance weakens. And so it was that a boy named Juan, the son of a storyteller and born during a rare eclipse, when both moon and sun touched the river at once, began to wander farther than other children dared, chasing the echoes of forgotten lullabies sung by birds no one else could hear. And one dusk, as the golden light curved across the hills, like spilled honey, he stumbled upon a cave mouth hidden by vines that hummed when touched, and within it lay walls etched with braids made of stone, of dust, of symbols older than ink, and in its center, half buried in river silt, was the shard of mirror, dark as night, slick with memory. And as Juan reached for it, the air thickened, the cave exhaled, and the shard's surface flickered, with visions of a queen whose face changed with every blink, whose eyes wept not tears but names. And in that moment, the boy did not feel fear, only a pull like hearing your name whispered by a voice you'd never met, yet somehow knew. And when he returned to the village, the shard wrapped in his cloth, he said nothing, for he didn't yet understand what he'd found, only that it belonged to the story that had never truly ended, the one that lived in the space between braids and silence, between memory and magic. And that night, the wind passed through the village like a warning, curling around the shrine, before slipping into the cracks of the earth, whispering in a tongue only the roots could answer. And in the dark, the bone-white comb shivered ever so slightly, though no hand had touched it. By the time the next full moon rose, round and red like an omen carved from blood-orange stone, Juan had begun to change in ways that made even the wind pause before brushing his skin. For the shard he had hidden beneath his sleeping mat no longer stayed still at night. It whispered, not in words but in rhythms, pulses, dreams that dripped like ink into his sleep, showing him places he'd never been, faces he'd never seen, and songs he could suddenly hum without ever learning. And though his mother noticed how his eyes glowed faintly at dusk and how the shadows in his room grew longer than his body, she said nothing, remembering too well the price of truth spoken too soon. Yet the village had learned to watch carefully, and soon the eldest among the drummers, Orode, came to sit by the boy each evening, tapping his fingers in slow, ancient patterns to test whether the rhythm in Juan's breath still belonged to the living or had begun to echo the old world. And it was during one of these silent vigils that Juan finally spoke, not in his voice, but in a layered murmur like wind moving through reeds. And the words he spoke were not his own, but a naming, a calling, of the 6 other mirrors that had once completed the reflection shattered to bind the hunger of queens. And he named them not with names but with memories, the mirror of thirst, buried in a desert that bleeds salt, the mirror of laughter, hidden in the ruins of a forgotten city beneath a lake, the mirror of silence, trapped inside the last breath of a dying lioness, the mirror of truth, guarded by the blind drummers of Nkaranza, the mirror of flame, suspended in the smoke of an eternal fire pit, and the mirror of dust, cradled in the palm of a statue that no longer stands. And as he named each, the shard in his hand flared with a lightless glow, pulling thin strands of ash into itself as if drinking from the memory of the air. And Orode, though trembling, touched the boy's shoulder and knew what had returned was not the curse, but the key to understanding what had been left behind when Ifean and Zulai buried the last comb. For it had never been about the object alone, but the mirror it refused to show. And now that mirror was trying to make itself whole again. And though Juan did not yet know why it had chosen him, the elders did. For his birth under eclipse marked him as a bridge between light and dark, memory and shadow, and the time was coming when someone would have to walk into the forgotten places and gather not power, but reflection, and decide whether to mend what had been broken or scatter it forever. As the first rain of the new planting season fell upon Oju Oloken, its rhythm softer than drum beats but older than prayer, Juwon stood alone beneath the baobab, now bearing blossoms once more, though they glowed faintly blue, as if mourning something that hadn't yet happened. And the shard in his hand hummed with a hunger that was not evil, but searching, like a child looking for its lost name. And he knew now what must be done, not from any elder's telling, but because the dreams no longer waited for night to speak, and even the birds had begun to mimic the songs he hadn't yet sung. So with his mother's silence wrapped around him like a farewell, and a road's drumbeats echoing faintly behind him, Juwon left the village without ceremony, walking into the dawn with bare feet and eyes full of memory, guided not by map or star, but by the pulse of the shard now hanging from his neck on a string of old cowrie shells. And his journey took him first to the edge of the sunless dunes, where the mirror of thirst was said to bleed, and there the sand moved like breath, whispering in languages it hadn't spoken in centuries, testing his resolve. And when he found the stone well buried beneath 7 layers of salt, the mirror inside was cracked but alive, and as he touched it, a wave of heat surged through his spine and showed him a queen once named Omanira, whose thirst for youth had turned her people into vapor, and from her reflection, the shard drank her sin, dimming slightly as if weighed by truth. And Juwon wept, without knowing why, before continuing south to the ruins of Olarun's laughter, where water covered the bones of forgotten palaces and fish with human eyes swam in silence. And there he dove into the lake, deeper than breath would allow, pulled by a melody that tickled his ribs like lost joy. And he emerged with the second mirror, wet and laughing, though his mouth remained closed, and the shard grew heavier still, now bearing both thirst and laughter. And he pressed on, guided now not only by dreams but by distant whispers from the other mirrors, as if they sensed each other's awakening. And in the breath of a dying lioness he found the mirror of silence, her body turning to wine the moment he retrieved it, gifting him a stillness that made even the trees bow. And as he crossed into Nkoranza, the blind drummers welcomed him not with words but with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, revealing the mirror of truth hidden in the pulse of their drums. And there he learned that to know truth is to bleed quietly, for the mirror cut him when he touched it, and the shard swallowed his blood without remorse. And when he reached the mouth of Mount Irinwo, where flames danced without fuel, the mirror of flame hovered in smoke, unburned yet burning, and it sang of a queen who had danced on the ashes of her mother. And lastly, he found the mirror of dust, in the broken palm of a fallen statue buried in ivy and time. And as he touched it, all 6 mirrors fused with the shard, forming a circle of darkness and memory so dense the air around him dimmed. And in that moment, Juwon understood these were not just mirrors, but pieces of one truth broken long ago to stop something too powerful from remembering itself. And now that truth had a vessel, and that vessel was him. And though the road back to Oju Oloken lay ahead, it was not the same village he would return to, nor was he the same boy who had left barefoot at dawn. When Juwon returned to Oju Oloken, the wind stopped moving, as if even the air dared not breathe in the presence of what he now carried within him. For the shard around his neck was no longer just a piece of mirror, it had become a vessel of all 6 reflections, bound by the boy's blood, his breath, his silence, his laughter, his thirst, his truth, and his dust. And as he stepped into the village square, barefoot and aged by the weight of things not meant for youth, The ground beneath his feet trembled softly, and the baobab began to shed blue blossoms in a spiral, forming a path that led not to the shrine of Ireti, but to the foot of the mountain, where the sky first kissed the earth. And the villagers, sensing the shift, gathered without command, silent as mourning cloth, their eyes wide with knowing. For every grandmother began to hum the same melody, at once a lullaby older than the comb, older than hunger, a song braided into the bones of the land before language. And as Juan stood among them, the mirrors inside the shard began to pulse, each beat calling out to something hidden. And from the earth rose 7 figures, women made not of flesh, but of memory, light, and braided shadow queens whose reflections had been trapped within the mirrors for generations, and now released. They spoke not with tongues but with gaze, looking into Juwan's soul and seeing themselves, and one by one, they reached forward, not to reclaim power, but to surrender what they had held onto for too long. Their grief, their ambition, their mistakes, and their wisdom. And with each touch, Juan shuddered, for their memories passed through him like storms, overwhelming and sacred, until the final queen, faceless no more, stepped forward, her face now his own grandmother's, but younger, soft, full of longing, and she wept, not for what she had done, but for what she had forgotten. And she asked not with words but with trembling hands, "Will you break the circle?" And Juan, without speaking, opened his hands, and the shard shattered into dust that rose into the sky, forming a single braided spiral before dispersing into starlight. And the sky turned the color of old ash touched by new fire, and the earth sighed as if it had waited forever to exhale. And the 7 queens dissolved into light, their echoes settling into the roots of the baobab. And for the first time in generations, the village of Oju Olokan felt empty, in the way a wound feels after healing, tender, strange, free. And Juan collapsed not in pain, but in peace, held by the elders as the night rolled in soft and silent. And the final blossoms of the baobab turned white, glowing like moon milk, signaling that the story had turned its final braid and now waited only to be told. Years passed like a hush through tall grass, and the name Juan became a story, then a song, then a silence that even time dared not disturb. For though he awoke from the collapse beneath the baobab, with no shard around his neck and no voices in his dreams, something within him had changed so deeply it no longer had a name. And he lived quietly, becoming a storyteller like his mother. But when he spoke, even the fire listened, and children gathered not only to be entertained but to remember. For he did not tell the stories as they were, but as they had become, shifting and breathing like the forest after rain, always alive, always growing. And as the decades unfolded, the rite of unbraiding remained the heart of Oju Olokan, not a ritual of fear, but of reflection, where each child braided a strand into the memory tree and told one story of their ancestors, not for power, but to keep their names woven into the world. And beneath that sacred baobab, its blossoms now white and eternal, a small shrine was built, not of stone or salt, but of woven grass, clay, and truth, where no relics were kept, only questions. And it was said that if you knelt there at dusk and asked the wind what it remembered, it would answer in your own voice, whispering the story you needed most to hear. And though Juwan's hair grew silver and his voice grew soft, he was never called seer or hero, only Griot. And when he finally walked alone one morning into the same forest where Zulai once vanished, no one followed, because they knew stories do not die, they return to the earth that birthed them. And as he disappeared beyond the trees, the wind carried a final word across the village, not shouted but braided into breath. Remember. And in that moment, the entire village, young and old, paused, closed their eyes, and felt the weight and warmth of all that had come before, not as fear, not as sorrow, but as a truth that could never again be hidden beneath combs, mirrors, or silence. And so the story ended not with a curse broken or a kingdom restored, but with a people finally learning that the truest power is not in youth, beauty, or memory, but in the sacred act of telling what came before, so nothing and no one would ever be lost again.